Singularity.
My name is Nicola, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoy this podcast, you can help me make it better by either writing a brief review on iTunes or by simply going to conversationswiththefuture.com and making a donation. My guest today is Peter Törnberg. Peter is assistant professor in computational social science at the University of Amsterdam, where he studies the intersection of AI, social media, and politics. His recent books include Intimate Communities of Hate, Why Social Media Fuels Far-Right Extremism, and Seeing Like a Platform, an inquiry into the condition of digital modernity. In our conversation today, I hope to explore how platforms have become the new eyes of power, why algorithms don't just reflect society but reshape it, and what it means to live in an age where complexity itself becomes the logic of control. So, welcome to Singularity FM, Peter.
Thank you so much. It's great to be on.
Fantastic. So, Peter, let's dive right into the deep end. James Scott taught us how states see their citizens. You argue that platforms have now become the new way of seeing. So let me ask you this. If Facebook, Google, and TikTok are today's eyes of power, what exactly do they see when they look at us, and what do they miss?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it really hits at the center of our book. So I would say, because James Scott, and when he described how the state sees, I would argue that he actually described a specific way that the state could see, a specific way of representing people. And there's actually a long kind of Foucauldian literature on precisely this, and the fact that the modern state emerged together with statistics and demographics and these sciences and this way of representing people and understanding populations. And statistics, it's the science of the state, right? It's literally what it means. And I think those ways of seeing, in some ways, they represent a way of seeing the population like a type of machinery. So it has this hierarchy with components as institutions, and we can kind of take it apart. We can see how variables interact. And James Scott, of course, in his book, he kind of studied how that reshaped the world. It not only represented the world and simplified the world, but it also reshaped it through its representation. So basically, people were making maps and trying to do calculations, and to make it as simple as possible, they also shaped the cities and even forests so that they would be a simple grid, and you can just calculate averages easily and surface areas, and therefore kind of control your population, and thereby also reshaping the population. And what we're arguing is that we're seeing a kind of shift with the rise. So we're moving in the sciences from statistics to kind of machine learning, data analysis, and AI. And that also represents a shift in the type of data. So going from kind of the variables and variances type of data to kind of what's been called big data. And with that, we also have kind of new metaphors, that we moved from the metaphors of the machine to metaphors like self-organization, networks, clusters, flows, and so on. And with that, there's a lot of things that are possible to see that the old ways of seeing the world weren't able to capture. But we're also losing other things in how it's representing the world. And I think a lot of what we're focusing on is what it does to kind of narratives, stories, and meaning making, and like the kind of full breadth of being human. And these are things that are not being captured. But I think we can also go into specific things. So the fact that platforms are optimizing their users for engagement to extract data as much as possible, and to create as much as engaging content as possible, while also having this type of content also has very destructive effects on the population and the world and society and our politics, because it's also highly polarizing ways of organizing society, which I think in the long term is damaging also to the platforms themselves.
So what do they see, those platforms, whether it's Google, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, you name it, what do they see when they perceive us? whether as individuals, if that's even possible, or in aggregate as statistical kind of body of individuals?
Yeah, so it's moved really from, if in the kind of uh, era of the state that James Scott studied, where it was like kind of periodical studies where you got an entire population, representative sample of the population, and you did some measurements to understand what the population was, and you could do kind of statistics on it, calculating averages and so on. And we moved from that to really this kind of constant flows of data, of flows of behavior, and they're clustering on that. And the other logic that we've seen the rise of it is kind of prediction-based logic, where you're trying to categorize users and you're trying to see how you can optimize certain outcomes. And so that optimization and this idea of finding certain categories, optimizing by doing modifications to your algorithms, that has really become the dominant thing. And engagement is often the thing that these platforms are optimizing for. But of course, it can also be other things. So shaping your behavior in certain ways. And like, of course, those become in certain ways very focus on kind of one aspect that can have really destructive consequences.
So just like, for example, you could have a natural forest with a wide diversity of species and a kind of a very random geographical or geometrical pattern of growth. The same would apply to a population pre-statistical methods of investigation and analysis. And now that we find ourselves in the age that we do, we are basically data points to be categorized, optimized, and kind of clustered in by certain kind of features in a uniform, sort of proportional, geometrically symmetrical way, if I may put it this way. What's the problem with that? What's the downside? What are they missing?
Yeah. So forest is a good example because it's also something that James Scott looked at. So James Scott looked at the German scientific forests and the emergence of these forests in the 19th century. And basically the idea behind forest was that we can, if we have homogeneous trees and we have them in straight lines and so on, we can calculate the amount of forest production per square meter, and we can basically turn forestry into science. Which was great to a certain extent because it gave the state more kind of control, it helped taxation, and so on. But it's turned out that it also had a lot of downsides because the forest became very vulnerable to disease that could spread because there's only one type of tree. So you didn't have this diversity to reduce the spread of certain insects and so on. And the second thing was that wind, for instance, could have really catastrophic consequences on the forest because since they're all the same size and the same weight, you get this really powerful wind gusts, and especially in this German where they have these open spaces going through the forest, which also could have really catastrophic consequences for the forest. And so the argument of James Scott is that like we need to have a more kind of complex understanding. And so what we argue is that like these notions of complexity enable new ways of finding of organizing forests, for instance, or organizing any system where it's kind of emerging from the bottom up. So instead of like planning from the top down and drawing a map and thinking out your forest, you're drawing some kind of algorithm, allowing it to in some ways emerge on its own, but directed by you. And this, I think, it can have a lot of positive consequences. It does bring it, like, enable a lot of things to become visible in some ways. Like, and it potentially, I haven't necessarily seen this in the example of forests being applied. It's also not exactly my field of expertise, but I could imagine it solving a lot of these problems, right? Because you could actually store the data of where trees are located, and that could potentially have positive consequences for these consequences. But there are also things that are not seen in this, and that's what we're focusing on. And I think it's also not entirely easy always to know what that is being lost, but there's always something there because the world is neither a complex system nor a complicated system. We can go into more detail about what that means.
Yes, and from the Canadian experience, I can say that the problem with such sort of monocultured, industrialized forests, and in Canada we have a few, they become very risk prone to any kind of pests. For example, the I think it's called the great pine beetle or something like that is devastating Canada's forests as we speak. And one of the reasons is because there is a lack of diversity in the forest. So usually the pine trees are dispersed among a bunch of other trees, so they're not too close to each other. So if one tree gets infested with the pine beetle, it's hard for it to move to another tree. But once you get them all together and there's no different trees in between, then these beetles can basically just infest the entire forest and devastate everything. So the risk exposure grows up not just with respect to wind, but also pests or any other potential risk factor, right?
Yeah, for sure. No, for sure. I think that, and this is the case for forests, but the kind of James Scott argument is that this generalizes to a broad set of systems. So cities would be another example where you
Or
have
humans
cities
in our
built.
case.
Yeah, I mean, so cities being an example where like humans are living together in a big community, and like how do you organize this community in a way that has positive consequences, and then they were for a long period organized in the same way as in this kind of top-down way, this kind of functionalist way as the German forests. And the argument from James Scott is that the outcomes weren't great. So you have these kind of cities that were planned from the top down. He uses the example of Brasilia, and argues that it doesn't have the human scale, and so you're losing the kind of complexity of the city. And so I think that he makes a really important argument in this, in showing the way that the modern state, by its way of seeing and its way of representing the city and social systems and nature, how it could have unanticipated consequences when you make interventions to it, and often really catastrophic effects. And the Soviet Union, the communist system, was another example that he drew on quite extensively.
Yeah, and in our case, as a former or recovering political scientist, I'm always concerned about the implications on power. Who gets to be empowered? Who gets to be weakened? How does that sort of impact the uh, statuses or the different political participants within a democratic society? And is it like equalizing or distributing that power, or is it just focused in a single cluster of sort of mega power players and so on? But before we continue, let me just backtrack a little bit, because I just wanted to give a little taste to our audience here. But I want to backtrack a little bit in time and talk about the why first. The why and the who. So, who, in other words, who is Peter Törnberg? And what path led you from computational methods and social media research to writing Seeing like a Platform? Maybe if you can give us sort of the genesis story of how you got to be interested in data sciences. Was there a spark or a story or an occasion? And then from the general field of data scientists, why specifically did you decide to focus exclusively or predominantly on platforms?
Yeah. I mean, like, if we're starting from the beginning, like, I've always been like a nerd, even growing up, and like, I loved reading these books about these big, these big people who shaped the sciences through history. And I was kind of thinking when I was like 12 or 13 or something, I was like, what's going to be the next kind of revolution? What's going to be the next big thing that's going to change society? And I thought AI is going to be it. And so I kind of set on a path there. Already that I wanted to study AI, and specifically at like artificial neural networks seemed to me what was going to be the changing technology. But then at some point, I also, because my brother Anton Törnberg, who's a sociologist, professor in sociology, he was always the kind of sociologist and social scientist, and so we would always have these debates. From being kids up until today, basically, where I was kind of the technical brother and he was the sociologist. And with that kind of interaction interface and these two different ways of seeing society and seeing the world, which comes with these two perspectives and these two disciplines, I kind of over time became more and more corrupted by him and kind of entered more into the social sciences, but also with this idea that with the kind of realization that it's not just about the technologies that are changing the world, because it's not that we don't have enough food or resources to feed or take care of everyone in the world. That's not the problem. It's that the problem is the distribution, and the problem is what happens to these technologies as they enter into society. And the hard problem is not to develop AI, it's that what happens to society as AI is developed, and how do you prevent it from leading to terrible consequences in the world and lead it to actually something positive. And so that's the kind of the longer story of what I've been interested in. But in studying artificial neural networks, because this was the path I ended up in, and so I chose the bachelor in computer science and the master's in complex adaptive systems, because that was the path in Sweden to study neural networks at that point. And this idea of complexity and emergence, because the properties, of course, of artificial neural networks are emergent. And thinking about the nature of that idea of complexity and how it I saw around me, became increasingly applied to understand also not only physics, but also the social world. Also, it's kind of spreading throughout the sciences. And so I became really interested also in that idea, and the idea of society as a complex system, and what does it bring with it. Because it was, of course, very much entangled with platforms and this idea that Facebook, couch surfing, all of this, like the sharing economy that would change the world and enable kind of a self-organizing society without leaders, without power, without the state. All of these optimistic ideas that we were all kind of living through like up until 2010, 2015, like they all came with these complexity ideas that I knew from physics. But it also seemed different, and it also seemed like they were failing to capture something about the world that they were describing. And so I became interested in those failures, but also why are we using these terms, and what is the meaning of it, and what are the implications of it? And then suddenly became much more a question of power, and the question of who financed the development of places like Santa Fe Institute, and led to the spread of these ideas, and whose interests were supported by them, and so on. And thinking of it more as an ideology that is actually very, very much an expression of contemporary financialized capitalism, and so on. So this was kind of a long story through which this book developed, and a kind of folding in on itself as we kind of used the ideas of the book to analyze the book itself and the endeavor. And so it was a constantly changing kind of mission.
Was there a single spark moment when you realized that complexity science and platforms weren't just technical tools, but actually new metaphors for power? Like an aha moment where you were like, okay, before today, I was the data science nerd. Today, I am about the power implications about data science. So that is kind of the really cool part, rather than the data science itself.
I think it was really a kind of a gradual thing, but I think also with during my PhD was really when I went from a master's in physics, and then ending up in my postdoc was in sociology. So, and during my PhD, it was kind of applying these physics approach, like these physics methods and metaphors to understand society, but at the same time also being kind of self-critical and like trying to understand, but what am I losing by doing this model, and like what is left out, what is this missing, and then seeing these methods being applied and these arguments and metaphors being applied at a scale, and like, but we're missing a lot here, and this missing has political consequences, and power, as you're saying, like there's this like it's the fundamental thing that we're all thinking that decentralization, networks, self-organization, that these are words that somehow would imply equality, democracy. And in fact, that's really not the case. There's in networks have like a tendency towards an extreme centralization of power, actually, like a lot of these going into a network society is not like Manuel Castells was saying this is going to bring equality to everyone, because we all have equal possibilities. But instead, we get this extreme centralization of attention and resources and power into a small number of hands, and that is something that's completely kind of erased in the social science discipline around it, or at least was at the time.
Yeah, we can even see that well represented in the music industry. My father-in-law has been a professional musician for over 50 years. And, in the good old days, he used to get, seven, eight, sometimes $10,000 a year worth of royalties, because he's one of the best jazz musicians in Canada. He's been in a number of movies all over the place. And so every year he would get, call it roughly 8 to 10,000, which is very, very substantial amount of money for a professional, for a working musician who has the father of 3 girls and stuff like that. Now, as of most recently, he was getting checks from royalties for about 3 cents a year, right? So, and he's still super popular. You wouldn't say, well, he's not a popular guy. Actually, he's super popular. His stuff is run in the millions and millions of times. But because the platforms have shifted the way they handle royalties, and the piece of the pie for the actual musician has become infinitesimally smaller than it's ever been. So 10,000 roughly became now a couple of cents a year, or maybe it was 20 cents. I don't remember the exact amount, but it was literally ridiculous. It wasn't worth the stamp that it was mailed on to get to him. It was kind of utterly ridiculous. And of course, if you're Taylor Swift or Beyonce, you're making billions of dollars. But most
if you're
musicians,
the owner of Spotify,
yes,
you make billions
isn't he
of dollars.
Swedish, by the way?
Yeah. Sorry about
that. So there you go. You have a platform which is supposed to kind of be decentralized and sort of empower everyone, musicians, users, music fans, and everyone. And yet the way it actually works in the real world is concentrating power rather than disseminating it.
Yeah, I think this kind of transition of the internet and like early social media to the moment we are today, where we like went from all of these promises about democratization, like this public discourse that was going to be more functional and democratic and participatory, more equality, and we had all of this, data wants to be free, and all of the optimism that was at the moment where I was growing up, and like I was very
90s.
much growing up on the 90s, early 2000, and like I was very much growing up on the internet, like early nerd, IRC channels and stuff, and how that was kind of betrayed, and we got this exact opposite, this extremely financialized, commercialized internet, where it's just completely dominated by a few extremely powerful platforms that are making their money through their power, not by being kind of competitive in like by selling the best stuff, but by locking us into ecosystems and then using that to extract rents, and this kind of what's been called enshittification of the internet. I mean, I think that's the broader context as well that like this book is kind of pointing towards and yelling at.
Yeah, I think it was Cory Doctorow who coined that term, the enshittification of the internet, which is a brilliant sort of metaphor of putting it. But in your book, you contrast industrial modernity with digital modernity. Can you unpack that distinction a little bit for us? You talk about machines, how it used to be with the Henry Ford sort of moment. We had machines, and then the metaphor became organisms. We had factories at the top of the sort of industrialization moment, and nowadays we have platforms. So can you unpack, please, this for me?
Sure. So Fordism or high modernity was really the the high point of this type of modern state that we've been talking about. So this point of time where the notion of the society as a machine becomes really spread throughout society, and like it stemmed a lot from this kind of, it's been referred to as Fordism because of its like sourced in the kind of really extreme automation that Ford had in his factories, and the way that he used the factory and the way of organizing the factory as a kind of large machine, but that also spread into the kind of the lives of workers outside of the factory, and like so how schools were organized with the same kind of same idea of top-down institutions, and like having really strict hierarchies and strict organizations, like kind of a military structure that was kind of spreading throughout society, and the factory became a kind of arch metaphor for an entire society. So there's been like a lot of social scientific research on this society and how it spread. And an example is also the fact that you have everyone knows that you have kind of mass production, that this factory was able to produce cars very cheaply at a very large scale, but that any mass production society also needs a mass consumption society, right? You need a certain type of consumer who wants to buy these goods. Like the famous Henry Ford quote that you can buy the Ford in any color you want as long as it's black. So basically, you need to produce a consumer who's happy to buy that kind of product. So it was a very homogenizing society, a very repressive society in many ways. But then we saw the breakdown of that society in the 70s. 73 is often quoted as consumers, markets. Yeah,
We'll get to that moment of crisis, but before that, the word. So you reminded me that statistics comes from the root meaning, if I forget, a tool of the state, or the science.
Of the state, I think.
Yeah, science for the state. Yeah, and I, when you were talking about Fordism, I was reminded about the term jerk and jerking around. So basically, the militarization of production and Taylorism came into the Ford factories, and you literally had people with stopwatches timing workers to perform a certain operation and trying to shave a second or two of their movements or of their production all the time. And that was what was called to jerk people around, basically to time them and to make them go faster and faster, and hence the term jerk. That's where it originates. Let's go back to power here. Where does power fit within this picture? Because there's an interesting transition that happens here from industrial modernity to digital modernity with respect to power, and especially the role of abstraction. You're right that the power needs abstraction. Like, for example, we were talking about statistics and the state, right? What do you mean by this, that power needs abstraction, and how does the abstraction of digital platforms differ from that of the abstraction of states or the Ford factories?
Yeah, I mean, so during this era, the powerful people were basically looking at an organization chart and then like drawing out as like a machine, like this is this department, this is going to do this, and it's going to interact with this department, and basically designing social institutions like a machine. And it's very explicit, very top-down power. It's just like, I'm the boss and I'm going to decide how this institution is going to be run, and like this kind of command and control form of power, right? But as we transition into the digital, what we call the digital modernity, which is it's a society where we don't have the top-down power in the same way, but rather it's this what seems like a kind of bottom-up organization. So basically, in digital modernity and in platforms, the powerful are providing a context through which we're interacting, like this. Things like Facebook or Twitter, for instance, or Airbnb or whatever, or also more abstract forms of platforms. And what the powerful are doing is not designing those as like, not telling people what to do, not command and control, and it's not like designing hierarchies. It's just like setting the rules of interaction. And so basically deciding, what does the message box say? Who shows up in your feed? Like which is the video that shows up to you? Like these kind of subtle things that are often that we think of as kind of organic, or that can even be invisible to us, compared to having someone yell at you what you're supposed to do, which is very visible and very easy to see. These are things that are instead built into the very infrastructure, and that can be subtle or invisible. So the changing of a color of a button from green to blue can affect our outcomes on a collective level, but of course we don't really notice.
So yeah, so all of those things or incentives or the context, I have a whole keynote about why content is not king, but context is king, actually, because the meaning of anything is determined not by the content itself, but the context that's wrapped around it. And those who control the context control the meaning of whatever we want to talk about.
But medium is the message, as McLuhan put it.
Exactly right. That's why Marshall McLuhan famously said that the medium is the message. But let me make it even more complex here by throwing in complexity science, because we're already talking about how order emerges and how this is not centralized top-down, like, for example, during the Eastern Bloc sort of Cold War period in socialism, but it's kind of more like people who have certain kind of design input on the platform, who are creating the incentives, who are choosing even the colors. But all of those things have actual power implications and hierarchical implications about how power is disseminated, how value is aggregated, how economic profit is concentrated, and all of it. So now complexity science suggests that order emerges from the bottom up. That's like what happens, for example, in nature and stuff, right? But you argue that this very metaphor that order is emerging from the bottom up can conceal power. How does self-organization, on the one hand, because they're saying, look, these platforms are self-organizing, right? And yet, on the other hand, your article, which was the original thing that sparked my interest in your work, is called The Ascendance of Algorithmic Tyranny, where you talk about the domination of those algorithms. So how does one kind of move from self-organization and end up with a tyranny of algorithm and the platforms as a tool of domination?
Yeah, there's an interesting thing, because we have this kind of association between bottom up and democracy, as I was saying before, that there's like that those systems would be like inherently more equal, and like there's the same kind of ideological thing built into complexity science when we're studying this system. Like you can read these papers about people studying markets, and then they find that the outcome of the interaction becomes this power law distributions where like 2% are controlling all the resources, and then they're making the argument, and therefore it's not a problem. It's not like there's no it's inevitable, it's natural, or something like that, as if things would be inevitable or natural just because they're emergent. I mean, we know that we can design systems to have certain outcomes, and we know that certain system designs have certain outcomes that are deeply problematic. And now with data analytics, the tools of complexity science, with modeling and so on, we have extreme control over emergent systems. Like if you have a platform and you want to drive a certain outcome, you can produce that outcomes. But you can do it in such a way that the outcome is very hard to see. And so what we're saying is basically there's no such thing as like a natural self-emergent system, like self-organizing system. Like they're not natural just because they're self-organizing. Not more natural than a system that you're designing from the top down. Both of those are constructed. I mean, and to a certain degree, it's just reproducing the old kind of Foucauldian debate about the market, where this neoliberal ideology was saying that the market and the market outcomes are natural and like inevitable, and the state interventions are unnatural and therefore bad. And of course, the counter argument is like, no, actually, the market is very much constructed by the state, and it requires the intervention a very active state to be anything like free. And whatever that means, like the laissez-faire is just like, it's just a made-up concept that is pursuing a certain ideology. And complexity, we argue, is basically just an expansion of that to a broader category of systems, where this kind of capacity to shape markets and then control the outcomes of those markets, which basically, I mean, what a platform is a kind of proprietary market, right? It's the platform controls set the rules for a market, and then certain outcomes result, and often results that the platform themselves are profiting from. And so there is a kind of, it's just a continuation of the same type of ideology, but into the digital world, which gives these platforms new powers that are outside of the market. It gives political and social power and can shape our very culture.
Even within the market itself, those platforms, they carve a niche and they dominate it. So within that particular niche, they become monopolies, pretty much. Even if you say, well, maybe not quite monopolies, they're oligopolistic, because there's like 4 or 5 of them. But Facebook, within the context of the Facebook platform, is a complete monopoly. No one else has any power of decision making. I mean, we've seen they have had this ethical overview board for a couple of years now, at least, if not longer. And every time the board comes up with certain kind of statement or suggestion or whatever, they're overruled and overridden. So it's kind of meaningless. In other words, to your previous point, that there is nothing so much random, really, but it's kind of deliberate and really top down. So under this kind of superficial emergent order, there is nothing random or superficial or emergent about it. It's pretty much top down, focused, and very deliberate about which way we want to take that platform, because the people who design it have certain incentives and certain goals, and they have the full power to implement. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg and his team are pretty much like Almighty God within the context of Facebook. They decide what goes and what doesn't go, what's right and what's wrong, how things are going to be. So if he decides...
as Zuckerberg himself put it, like Facebook is more like a state than a company. And I think that this is something that, just like we were saying, I think this is precisely it. These companies are trying to be monopolies, and it's not monopolies in the old like way that we understood it from the kind of steel and iron kind of monopolies of old.
Yeah.
But it's these monopolies, these digital monopolies, where they're trying to control certain choke points as a way of gaining social political power, make people dependent on their infrastructures, and then thereby have technological control, and use that to extract rents from, not from having like the best product, but just from, we have, what choice do you have? Like, what are you going to do? And from very, like, and which is this core of enshittification, right? Like that, these are not companies that are trying to produce the best products. These are companies that are trying to make as much money as possible. And those are often very different things.
Yeah. And we've seen that maybe in some ways their power is spilling a lot more beyond the technological virtual realm where they are founded in, and into politics, into economics, into the whole kind of structure, our social structure. And I can see how your brother's sociology can come very useful here, because you start up with a technological tool originally that was supposed to help everyone talk to everyone for free and all the time, all over the world, and like we can all be one big happy family. And actually the result is kind of very different, and it's definitely not free, but there's maybe even overwhelming costs which spill way beyond the technological realm into the politics, social, even sort of political and future oriented realms. In other words, it determines perhaps, or at least to some degree, the direction towards which our civilization is moving.
No, for sure, very much so. And these are, I think you make a great point, that these are not something that is constrainable to like that is specifically within the market or specifically economic, but because they're using social political power to like that's how they make money. Uh, that means that they're going to have huge consequences for like throughout society, and that this is really like a new model that is kind of characterizing contemporary capitalism, where it's just this kind of rentier capitalism, or it's been referred to as even a type of techno-feudalism, where these companies are used to trying to get control over society as a way to make money. And like the consequences for society are well known, like how it's affecting our politics, how it's affecting our culture, and our ability to kind of function as a society is very clear. Um,
Do you think that's an inevitable outcome? In other words, in your chapter on Anonymous, you talk about self organization mutating into new hierarchies. Do you think that all bottom up systems inevitably end up reconcentrating power?
so it's a good question. I mean, I think any type of bottom up system also needs some kind of top down structures, some like scaffolding to handle those things, and it needs to be a kind of feedback. I mean, and we also have one chapter on Wikipedia, where we're coming in and we're looking at Wikipedia, which is this. I mean, this is like the one like wonderful example that everyone draws on as this kind of self-organization and early digital technology that actually worked out and is still an amazing community. Um, but what we see when we look closer on those communities, that actually it has a lot of hierarchy, it has a lot of bureaucracy. It's very much a top-down institution, and like the reason that it functions and that it is democratic is precisely that it's not self-organizing. It's precisely that it's this kind of fairly hierarchical and top-down institution, um, which is it's very funny because there's this tradition of literature looking at the Fordist companies, these highly hierarchical top-down companies, where the CEO was kind of imagining the company as just working because of the plot he drew over this hierarchy. And there was this anthropological study showing that actually the reason that it works is that this model is wrong, and people are actually just talking to each other and working things out and telling stories and like developing their own kind of internal communities and complexity that is not visible. And that is also a lot of self-organization going on. And what we're doing is kind of the precise opposite. We're in an era where we're telling the story that these really self-organizing bottom-up structures, and that's why they work so well. And we're saying actually there's a lot of top-down, there's a lot of hierarchy here, and that's also part of why it's working. That's actually what enables the democracy and the functioning and prevents centralization of power and resources.
In other words, bureaucracy may be inevitable, but reconcentrating of power doesn't have to be, because proper bureaucracy will create some kind of checks and balances to ensure more equitable distribution of power or a wide diversity of point of views being represented. Whereas when you don't have that kind of structure and you have no bureaucracy whatsoever, you do end up still with some kind of highly concentrated power hierarchical structure. But there are no means to kind of make it more humane, if you will. Right? Tony Blair used to talk about capitalism with the human face, I think. But there is no way, once we are decentralized, once we go from central currency to Bitcoin, there is no way to have proper monetary policy that aims to accomplish certain kind of political or ethical or equitable goals, because the hierarchy is still there, but there is no mechanism to actually influence it in any way, other than the mechanism controlled by those in power, which is kind of counterproductive. So they're not going to be willing to go along that line.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it, precisely this. And I think that there's a kind of like complexity in this idea of self-organization. It comes from the natural sciences, right? And like this metaphors of like a flock of birds that is just, there's no central organizer. It's just all the birds are following certain rules, and it leads to this functional pattern, this organized whole that works really well for everyone. And imagining that society can work in the same way, like humans can also self-organize in the same way. But the problem of that is, of course, that humans aren't birds. We're not ants. We can observe the system that we're in, and we can try to benefit from the rules of this kind of the structure of this and the way that it leads to certain outcomes. So if we were birds, we would want to fly in the back of the flock the entire time, so we don't have to work as hard, for instance, and that would lead to certain problematic outcomes over time, because we are reflective beings that can kind of see the structure that we're in and can adapt our behavior in a way that in complex systems that kind of adaptation doesn't exist. And so we do need this kind of feedback where there's a kind of higher level feedback system where, okay, we're now having a kind of centralization of power, or we're having these problematic outcomes. We need to adapt the rules of the system. We need to adapt how this is functioning. And like you do need some kind of scaffolding. You do need some kind of hierarchy for that to function. And hierarchy, this very idea that like hierarchy would be inequality, and self-organization like would be equality, like it's just fundamentally wrong. Like that association, I think, is really the big threat to our contemporary society and our ability to address the problems that we have.
Okay, say that again, because that's an important point. So, in other words, the very idea or metaphor or even story, if you will, that decentralization is good for democracy, is good for equity, it's good for redistribution or distribution of power, is actually false.
Yeah, I would say that comes from, it's a metaphor or an idea that comes from the kind of industrial Fordist era, where to a certain degree that was true because power was organized from the top down and command and control and the man deciding things. But we're no longer in that society, and now that association between centralization and inequality, between decentralization and equality, and all of these things that you mentioned, becomes really destructive for any movement that is trying to change things, that are trying to improve society.
So I wonder who ends up governing in this kind of digital modernity you're talking about, when leaders claim they're only facilitating self-organization from the bottom up. You see, they say, we're not in charge of it, we're not like running anything, we're not sort of creating it, we're just like empowering all these decentralized entities, and this is the resulting world order. So who ends up governing, and what kind of a world do we end up in? Is it like post-democratic kind of world, or is it a completely different sort of a new system?
I mean, it's pretty clear who is ending up in power now, right? Like Elon Musk, the big platforms and the ones that are now have amounts of capital and amounts of power that is just kind of unprecedented in history. And in terms of the conventional form of democracy, we've just seen a kind of loss of power of the loss of capacity of the state to act. Since with the fall of Fordism, like since then, there's been a kind of move of power from democracy, from the state to the market, and this is just the kind of expansion of that as companies are starting to, in some ways, privatize the market itself and become kind of states that are controlling digital markets. And of course, it's reshaping politics itself, because our political system is not in any way immune of that. It's very much an expression of the ways that platforms, social media, define attention economies that lead to certain leaders and certain types of politics dominating. So it's very much shaping our politicians and our parties, and very much our politics. And I mean, we've also seen broadly for the last 26 years a democratic backsliding taking place, where we have fewer and fewer democracies in the world.
Do you think we are still in sort of the new liberal world order, or even if it's like at the kind of a tail end of it, or do you think we've already crossed into a new regime of modernity, as you call it, and what does that even mean?
Yeah, no, it's a tricky question, because it depends. Like neoliberalism it's a very fluid word. And if you would define it as a kind of a loss of state capacity and loss of state power in relation to the market, under that definition, we're definitely still in a kind of neoliberal moment. But if you would also associate it to a kind of free market where there's companies competing on some kind of notion of a global free market, then I mean that's definitely not the case, because we've very much transitioned into, and for quite a while, a kind of what's been referred to as digital capitalism or platform capitalism, where it's more about controlling, like it's more about power and controlling certain choke points and having control over infrastructure, and it's more this kind of power battle where that's how you make money, and that seems quite incompatible with classic kind of neoclassical and neoliberal theory. So it's a bit depends on how you would define the concepts, if this is a kind of a new phase of neoliberalism. But I mean, there is a broad discussion right now that we have really moved to a new political order in that sense as well, right?
Some have called it a new feudalism because it's a lot about kind of rent seeking. It's a lot about monopolies, not about competition. It's a lot about inserfication. If I mean, Cory Doctorow calls it the inshitification, but I would say inserfication, where we are all like serfs stuck in our digital lots, if you will, just like the serfs in Russia were stuck to their lot of land and were forced to, toil and like work the soil there to make a living, but they couldn't move freely. Today we're kind of our own digital serfs nowadays. We're stuck to these platforms. We don't have freedom to move away from one to another, and that has tremendous sort of a political implications, if you will. And the question to me then is there still space for any collective visions of progress? Or has digital modernity killed the very idea of a shared future? Because now it's all about individualism again, the visions of Elon Musk or Peter Thiel and Jeff Bezos and so on, all those kind of micro players with mega power. And it's not so much about a shared vision of the future, it seems. Is that dead?
I mean, I refuse to believe that that there wouldn't be resistance. And I mean, there's a lot of people very unhappy with this moment. I think that you're precisely right that it's proven difficult in the current era to turn that unhappiness into something constructive. And I think like we've seen this over and over again, and I think it's very much linked to this fear of centralization, that we have these moments that leads to movements that lead to nothing. We get like hundreds of thousands, millions of people protesting, but it's not anymore turned into institutions, into movements that have some kind of centralized, the ability to turn themselves into institutions and into demands that have power and that have the capacity to change things. It's just a kind of like because of this kind of ideas of self-organization and the inability to actually leverage and scaffold your own movements into something. And so I think like I completely agree. What we need is more utopias and more dreams about the futures. I mean, it's interesting. James Scott, a lot of what he kind of, when he's criticizing the modern state, is this idea of like, a state that's trying to improve the world, that has these ideas of utopias. And then it goes really poorly, has unanticipated consequences, and like the outcomes aren't as great. But what we've gotten instead is like a state that has no ambitions to improve the world. And where utopia and the idea that we can have a world that is better than this has somehow seemed suspect and seemed problematic. And of course, in a situation like that, it is very hard to dream about something better, and it also becomes hard to organize something better. And I think we need to gain back that capacity of dreaming of something better, and like
collectively better.
Yeah, collectively better, exactly.
A shared future that is better. And it's about that tricky balance. I grew up in socialist Bulgaria, and it had that kind of a utopian statist vision of the future, the great proletarian future in our case. And that was utterly horrendously criminal and inhumane and terrifying and just horrible in so many ways. But then giving up on that dream entirely and surrendering any desire or capacity of the state to impact or direct or guide in any way its citizens towards any kind of idea of a better future seems to be equally bad, perhaps. So we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, if you will. And it's a very tricky, slim balance we have to find.
Yeah, and it really led the entire world. I'm from Sweden myself, and we were kind of, finding our own third way between the two blocks, right? And actually trying to like go to our own society that we would, would choose of our own choosing, like some kind of socialism as well. But all of those dreams and the very possibility to imagine something being different is somehow lost now, which I think is just really sad. I mean, because I get asked this all the time of like, I do these studies about social media and how we could improve social media, and then I get this counter question, but like, would this be profitable for the companies? If we would change the algorithm in a way that it would lead to constructive politics and we would no longer have radicalization, would it be profitable? Because of that's of course the constraints that anything needs to be decided under now. And like, no, probably not. Probably we can't design an algorithm that is both not functional for society, that's not leading to polarization, radicalization, racism, horrible things, but that's also maximizing engagement and advertising profits for these big platform companies. But like, is this how constrained our imagination has of what society can be? Is this how constrained it is? Like the idea that we would like have these companies that are very much monopolies, that we would treat them as, we've always treated monopolies, and that the state would actually go in and do something about these problems, and that politics could actually change this thing, and that we can have some kind of collective power to solve what we know is like really deeply problematic things for society. Like that, even that imagination that is just so basic, it just doesn't even exist anymore, which is, I don't know, it's just depressing in some way.
So we have to cultivate that imagination. And what's the way to do it? Is it mythology? Is it storytelling? Because whether it's the idea of utopia, the original idea of utopia is this island in the middle of the Atlantic where people have kind of created the perfect society, that's a story. And then that kind of image, that kind of vision created that idea in the popular mind, if you will. Then, we have had the image destroyed by the collapse of maybe the Eastern Bloc and eventually even the neoliberal order. First the Eastern Bloc, then the neoliberal order. And so now we're left with a vacuum. And that's why there is no even motivation anymore. So I wonder, is the answer really not some kind of a new story, new mythology that can inspire and cultivate that kind of desire?
I mean, as an academic who writes in some ways stories for a living, this is of course what I believe, that we need to find some story that binds us together and that creates new communities and new paths of change. But of course, that is also taking place. That becomes possible in certain moments where we have these shifts of power, and I think that it feels like we're in one of those moments now, that we're in one of those maybe windows of opportunity to change things, with the kind of clear fall of the United States and the rise of China, the end of unipolar power, this move into artificial intelligence, and this new technological landscape. There are all of these reconfigurations of power and this kind of moment of uncertainty where at least there's some kind of hope to shape something new. And I think like this is the moment where stories maybe start to matter again.
Yeah, and there's a possibility in change to actually do something about it, right? Because the old order is already going away if it's not completely gone. And then we are in this kind of moment of possibility. Now, maybe the deck is stuck towards a certain outcome, but it doesn't mean we cannot sort of change the odds, if it were, or maximize the odds that we have. So let's talk about AI, because that's the technology of the day. Your conclusion frames AI as crystallizing digital modernity into what you call biopolitics. What do you mean by that?
So in some ways, I think AI and it becomes a kind of boiling down of a lot of this logic into, because I would say that AI is like it's so much more powerful than the platforms ever were as a control as a technology of power in kind of shaping our behavior and shaping our outcomes. And I mean, we're only beginning to kind of study the implications of this, but it's I think it like we talk about things like alignment, right? And like these alignment problems and so on. But of course, like this idea that we would align AI with humanity as if there was only like one humanity that had one interest is of course completely false, and is rather about a kind of power struggle of deciding what interest and what fundamental epistemology the AI will support and what it will pursue, and it becomes much more nuanced and dangerous in that sense. And so, in some ways, I think the debate around AI and the risks of AI has been a lot of the kind of paperclip destruction of humanity, which I'm not saying that that's not important, but it's losing and it's missing the type of dangers that is what we've seen over the last 20 years, the dangers that turned the amazing internet of my childhood into the kind of commercialized hellscape of today. That those are precisely the same companies that and the same economic interests that have that are controlling AI and that are shaping what AI is becoming, and that will of course use AI to pursue their interests and to gain profits through the same type of feudal powers that they've been pursuing so far. And so what we're focusing on and what we're interested in is like the kind of the way that these technologies are acting upon society, that are acting on individuals, and on how we understand the world, how we organize, and so on, because that will really be the central kind of question of the next few years.
My epitome with respect to AI came maybe about 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago. But anyway, it took way too long for me to be happy with myself. But it was in a moment where I realized, and it came in the form sort of like an African proverb, which goes something like this. The sheep will spend its entire life fearing the wolf, only to be eaten by the shepherd. Right? So, in other words, we have all this fear about the end of the world, the paper clipping of our universe, and all of this by AI. But actually, it's a lot more about what Frank Herbert said, which was in the beginning of June. He has this tiny little paragraph where he talks about there were these people who wanted to free themselves by outsourcing their thinking to the machines, only to find themselves enslaved to other people who control the machines. So to me, that's kind of been the bigger danger. Not to say that wolves are not dangerous, they are, but chances are if you're a sheep, you're not going to be eaten by the wolf. You're almost guaranteed, especially statistically speaking, you're guaranteed to be slaughtered by the shepherd. And that's what the platforms are to us. They're our shepherds. And they're sending us off to focus on the wolves. And there are wolves in the world, and there are real dangers. But statistically, and probability is that's only redirecting our attention for their own usage so that they can make use of our wool, our milk, our meat, and everything afterwards. That's how I kind of came up to this.
I think that's a great metaphor. It's really nice. I think that the context to kind of see this in as well is like where AI is now in these terms is kind of where platform capitalism was in, I don't know, 2008 or something, when we had, you know, all of this financial capital flowing into Uber and these companies, and it was kind of what's been referred to as the millennial lifestyle subsidy, because all of this financial capital was basically, you know, almost free taxi ride in any city in the world, you know, order takeaway with discounts, you know, subsidized by venture capital, and like it was hard to hate on platforms back then. Um, and then we've had this kind of gradual and shittification again, where once they've reached a kind of monopoly, they've, in the sense of we've become like dependent on these infrastructures. The buses aren't running as well anymore in the cities. You know, all of these kind of breakdown of other things that have made us dependent on these companies, and we don't have any choice anymore. Then suddenly prices are quickly rising, and the services are becoming worse and worse. And like right now with AI, we are in the kind of millennial lifestyle subsidy moment of AI. Maybe it would be more fair to call it student essay writing subsidy moment of AI, where these services are being subsidized and we have this very free competition and just burning endless amounts of capital for these purposes. But there will be a moment, and it won't be that far, when these platforms are and these firms are trying to figure out how to actually profit from this, um, when they're trying to uh, use their socioeconomic, socio-political powers that are gained by these technologies to try to profit, and then it's not going to be so great anymore.
Yeah, to me, that's actually part of the problem, is because we have currently hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars, more like trillions of dollars invested in AI. And yet, we're not investing in humanity, really. So to me, it's like having two kids, call one kid AI and the other kid you're human, and you're giving all the money, attention, nutrition, nourishment, everything to the one kid, to the AI, and you're completely abandoning or ignoring the other kid. And what's the likely outcome, right? So the gap between humanity and machines is only going to grow. And I mean, a civilization that is focused on perfecting its machines but abandoning its citizens is engineering its own collapse, I think. Right? That's why I'm such a big fan of the arts, for example, and the humanities. And STEM is all good, but we need STEAM. We need arts and humanities right in the very heart of all those things, because otherwise they would be self-destructive. That's my concern, and I don't think that investing in AI blindly or openly, as we have been, would simply solve all of our problems magically. They're so complicated. Like, take the Gaza situation, right? Horrendous situation. Very clear crimes against humanity in my book and stuff like that. That could never be solved by AI, right? No matter how smart it is, you need political will, you need sacrifices, and you need responsibilities. Maybe you could even need punishments and criminal investigations and stuff like that, right? So it's not just a matter of intelligence.
No, absolutely, and I think it's, in certain ways it's also like we're even blind in seeing like these financial investments going into these firms and the way that society is being organized. This is precisely the equivalent of these pursuits of utopia during the 20th century, where, you know, a state, a society would decide to pursue some kind of change, you know, build out the railways, build out, you know, like this, or these big dams, you know, all of these state projects of changing society in order to try to improve it. And in some ways, AI right now is not different from that. Its only difference is that it's not pursuing a utopia. It's not pursuing like trying to improve society. Like that's not why financial capital is going into this. It's because there's the hope of getting a very powerful technology that will get you a monopoly that would allow you to extract capital at like an unprecedented rate.
In other words, you're talking about platforms, but AI can become the ultimate platform of platforms, right? Governing not just flows of information, but also the flow of life itself. I mean, if it brings us to extinction, as some people are concerned with the paperclip example, or nuclear holocaust, or there's like endless biological pathogen, or whichever way you prefer, like AI is the platform of platforms, and he who control, or the people who end up controlling AI, would have the platform of
the
platforms.
Power. Yeah. No, for sure. I mean, and I say platform because it's still based, I mean, it's very much the same companies, the platform companies, and it's also very much based on the same forms of extraction, like this kind of techno-feudal model of how you make money in capitalism, which of course is supremely dangerous when you have those companies in control over AGI, over like an extremely a technology with unprecedented power. And it's also this kind of, at the same time, we have all of the state support for this development because it's seen as kind of a technology of geopolitical competition, with very little reflection on the impact that this will have on actual people, and like on if we get this level of automation, which I think to a large degree we've already achieved with existing technologies, we're just kind of waiting for it to really play out. How that will affect the labor market, how will we distribute resources, how will our society that is completely become dependent on work, on labor as a means of distributing resources, and where we don't have any models of, the state has lost, democracy has lost its power relative to the market. What will be the counterforce that will push for distribution, or if not that, redistribution of resources in society? Like that question, it's not only that it's not reflected upon, it's just that we don't even have a language for it. We don't even have a way of imagining something being different, and that we're kind of just letting it play out, and in fact encouraging it to play out, even though it seems very obvious that it will lead to very destructive consequences for most of humanity.
Do you think that complexity and data science bear some responsibility for that, in the sense that they seem to be becoming a new ideology? I mean, Yuval Harari calls it dataism, because nowadays in data we trust. So show me the data, and all of this. And then going back to the beginning of our conversation about creating statistics and monoculturing the demographics of our entire societies, right? So is complexity and data science kind of becoming an ideology?
I think very much so. And I mean, in the book, we trace this a little bit in one of the chapters where we kind of trace the history of complexity science, and which is kind of underlying the kind of epistemology and to a certain degree the ideology of data science and so on, and just which traces back to Santa Fe Institute, which is very much was backed by financial capital and was actually very much designed as an institution to be ideological, to be the kind of new, the new Chicago school of the digital era. And so tracing who funded that and so on, it's very clear that this was a conscious project to create a kind of ideology. And we have that paper didn't end up in the book. It's called For Heterodox Computational Social Science. It's with Justus Auchermark, is like the book. And in that paper, we're making the argument that computational social science and data science and data analytics, that they serve the same role in contemporary society that neoclassical economics served for neoliberalism. So that they are kind of the academic disciplines that serve to legitimize and that actually create these stories and these ideas that give value to data. Because giving value to data, and like this dataism, this ideology, is precisely what gives financial power to these companies. And data, that might be true or not. I lean more towards that it's not actually, that a lot of these stories that we have about the powers of algorithms and the powers of advertising and so on, that it's in some ways exaggerated. But it doesn't matter, because what matters is that it has the capacity to control the flow of financial capital. And if there's stories saying that data is valuable, you have a lot of data, and therefore you end up with bazillions of dollars, then you have financial power. You have the power to through money control, lock people into your infrastructures to exert political and social control in various ways. And so it becomes kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. And so therefore, in that sense, the ideology within financial capitalism that's completely driven by stories, by narratives, by hype, it becomes like the most important part, like those stories. And in that sense, I would very much blame us, computational social scientists, data analysts, for in certain ways spreading this ideology, but also for spreading this kind of acritical, unreflective ideas around what data is.
Yeah, that's going back to our previous discussion about how context determines the content, because data can be priceless or useless or pointless depending on the context you wrap around it. So if you control the context, you can determine the value of that specific data. And in the end of the day, the search for more data originates from the context which puts value on it. And therefore, he who control, or these people who control the context that claims that the value is in the data, in data we trust, are the foundation for this kind of a ideology or thinking, and therefore should bear the responsibility or the bulk of it.
Yeah. I have a new paper out in Media, Culture, and Society that kind of looks critically also at the role of more critical scholars in perpetuating these stories through criticism, because you've had this kind of surveillance capitalism, these ideas about the extreme control of afforded to platforms by data and by algorithms to shape our behavior in very detailed ways. And of course, like for most people that sounds awful, but if you're an investor, that sounds great. Like that's like, oh, so we can get like techno-feudalism and control people and make a ton of money. Okay, I'm going to invest in that idea. That seems great. So to a certain idea, like the very criticism, when it's focused on these algorithms and their powers and the power of data, it risks becoming part of the hype. And I mean, that has been kind of well recognized in the relation to AI, because it's so obvious that that these companies are kind of spreading the paperclip destruction as part of hyping their own technology and like as a way of kind of attracting more financial capital. But I think it was also true about platform capitalism, surveillance capitalism.
It's interesting that Warren Buffett often talks about, when he's looking at whether he's going to invest in a company or not, he's often talking about whether the company has what he calls a moat, which is again a very kind of a feudalist concept, right? So you have your kind of fortress, then you surround it with a nice moat, so the enemy he has hard time getting to your walls, your city's walls, and it's all kind of very feudalist language, very interesting to me.
Or as Peter Thiel put it, competition is for losers.
Exactly. And we know he's not the most pro-democracy guy, sort of, among those. But let me ask you this. Is the tyranny in algorithmic tyranny worse because it feels voluntary today? I mean, the older I grew up under a communist tyranny, okay? And we all knew that the government would tell you one thing, and we knew it's a lie. We knew it's not. We couldn't say it necessarily, like you can't vocalize it, but everybody kind of knew. Nowadays, it seems that awareness, that consciousness is gone. People are completely taken in, it seems to me, and completely absorbed. So do you agree that it is in some ways worse because it's voluntary or unconscious, if that's true at all?
Yeah, I can totally see that. And I mean, I think it becomes invisible in a way that erases your own agency, and it becomes very hard to have narratives around it. And as we said, like narratives for change and the idea that things could be different. And it has this tendency of just like, you blame yourself, that you are the one who failed because it didn't work out for you, because the structural forces and the power acting in the system are invisible. And of course that's worse. And it's also worse because you don't have the collectivity in the same way. You don't have this kind of the sense of recognizing that this is structural systemic things that are problematic, which much more visible. It was easier to hate your boss back then, or leaders were more visible, and the ways that they had negative consequences in your life were more visible.
If you had the power to pull the plug on one platform, which one would it be?
That's a good question. I mean, like, there's the first thought goes to the platforms that are most kind of visible and like obviously don't have amazing consequences on our life. And a lot of my research studies kind of Twitter or X, Facebook, and so on, that clearly have problematic consequences for our politics, and I would probably say X or Twitter based on that. But then the question is how central that actually is now, and if what would replace it would be better. And there, it's much harder to say. And so the question is, I would probably say something like to have the largest consequences, something like Amazon, and that are running a lot of the server systems for that are underlying a lot of these platforms. Of course,
Amazon Web Services.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, it would probably have quite a negative consequences for at least a period of time.
It will for commerce and even food and God knows what.
Yeah, exactly.
I
so
would
it's probably not a good idea to pull that plug, but yeah, in terms of affecting platform capitalism, it would probably be effective at least.
Yeah, I would personally pull the plug on Instagram instantly if I could do it. For me, that's the most hated one. I dropped that platform maybe a couple of years after it started, so it's been now many years.
So why? Tell me, why do you hate it?
I think, to my knowledge, it's kind of the most addictive, the most ADD incentivizing one, the most superficial, the one that gets us at the more kind of primal level, destroys our focus, destroys our attention, has tremendously negative effect, well proven and documented on the youngest generation, who are the most vulnerable to it and who are the most addicted to it.
Yeah. I would say, though, that probably the younger generation use TikTok even more, with a lot of the same negative consequences. So I think that in terms of actually, if the aim is to improve the world as much as possible, I would agree. Like one of those platforms that are used, and I'm seeing that with my students, the way that they are affected by, how much they use the platforms, and especially during the pandemic, how they spend, like 8-9 hours per day on TikTok. And you can imagine how hard it is to pay attention to a 2-hour lecture if that's how you spent years of your life, so I agree that, in terms of just direct improvements on society, I think that's a good response.
Yeah, that's a draw between those two. And I myself, I've never even been on TikTok. So that's why I've been on Instagram, but I've never been on TikTok. That's why I chose Instagram. But let me ask you this. Do you see yourself more as a critic, reformer, or a revolutionary of digital modernity?
I don't know if I'm much of either. I'm trying to find stories about that makes it visible the hidden ideologies that are shaping our current era. But in terms of being a kind of political organizer or person who actually organizes in movements, I'm less that. I haven't found my footing in that yet. So, but in another way of responding to the question would be, do I think that to rephrase your question a little bit, would be, do I think that the early optimism about platform, like sharing economy, and the optimism we had in the 90s, if that was like fundamentally misguided or naive. And you know, I kind of don't think so. I kind of think that we could, given the right kind of societal scaffolding, functioning type of institutions, I think we could use those technologies and the capacity of platforms and digital technology to shape decentralized institutions. Uh, like, I think that could be extremely powerful and useful to find new ways of organizing our economy and our society. And I think that if we had the ability to imagine things differently, if we had the political capacity to organize, I think we could use those powers to do really amazing things. Like, if we had, you know, the ambitions of utopia now with these technologies and with these new powers, I think we could do a much better job than the state that James Scott was criticizing. We
The
could bring
problem
in a lot
is
of the complexity.
one person's utopia is another person's dystopia. So, and Elon Musk has a variety of utopian visions that he's pursuing. So, again, it's like some kind of a very tricky balance to get to.
Yeah, I mean that idea, like that utopia would be the end of politics and the end of history. Like that's not how I would envision it. We were always going to have conflict and disagreement. Like that's the definition of a plural society, if it's well functioning, is that we have a lot of conflict in it. But to me, a utopia, like a better society, a society that is able to like handle those conflicts, to channel them in productive ways, and give space, uh, and like have these positive values where those conflicts are turned into trying to make society a little bit better every day.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps
Which is
now is
kind
the
of what we
time.
were hoping that Facebook and Twitter would be, like 20 years ago. We
Yes,
were hoping that those platforms would enable us to do that, and they've done the
yes,
exact opposite.
yes, yes. Perhaps now is the time to go back to that 1973 or 1970s oil crisis. Was it 1973? I'm trying to remember the year, but it was in the 70s. Jimmy Ford was the president in the United States. So if platforms are today's Fordist factories, what is their equivalent of the 1970s oil crisis that could potentially bring them down?
Yeah, like
What could trigger it, and can we do it?
yeah,
How can we do it?
I kind of thought that like the post-pandemic moment of rising interest rates, that would be the kind of, and there was a moment there where the platform valuations just fell off a cliff. uh, and I even started writing a paper about this and about how they wouldn't recuperate, and how it would turn out that they weren't able to use their powers, and so on. uh, of course I had to eat that paper, so to speak, because it's not how it played out. And we instead had like the rise of kind of AI as the new bubble of where a lot of this financial capital went in. uh, but I think, yeah, I think this is just fundamentally unpredictable, but I think it's much more volatile and much more unstable than we think. Like, because this is about stories that are controlling these flows of capital, and like if we lose, if society loses trust in those stories, if like, which goes very quickly, like the bubbles that we're undeniably in, um, they pop very quickly. And every time that happens, there's always the possibility of a more fundamental change. And especially in this situation where we are now, of uh, volatility and clear dysfunction in the existing economic system, and just broad spread unhappiness with how things are organized, I think there is that possibility. um, but just as with Fordism, I don't think anyone would at that moment would have said, that what would spark it would be, Palestine, and leading to the oil blockade. Like that was not what was, no one would have said that. And I think that it's going to be just as unpredictable this time.
Yeah, that's well said. And I interpret that statement as a statement of optimism too, because it doesn't mean it will change for the better, but it means that it can. And a small stone can flip the big card. So just like Palestine did in the 70s, who knows? Maybe Gaza will do it today, or maybe it will be something else. But it such change can happen, and that's an optimistic view, I think, because the alternative is an overdetermined, data scientific, deterministic future, which doesn't look so good for us, I think, in the moment at all. Peter, time is advancing here, so I'm in the last 3 questions here of our conversation. So let me ask you this. If complexity and platforms reshape power invisibly, how can ordinary people who listen to this podcast, or activists, or even policymakers, there's a few of those, but not too many, but still a few, how could those people resist or at least negotiate with this new form of control that you call platform control?
Yeah.
Or platform tyranny, algorithm tyranny.
Yeah, I often...
How do we wrestle with it?
Yeah. I mean, I think like in the kind of daily life, it's just extremely difficult to do, right? I think we can be more conscious, and we can be more conscious of like, when we're on TikTok or Instagram or whatever, how it affects us, and like how it changes our life and how we view things, and trying to recognize those as sources of power and as working in the interest of certain people. We can be more questioning, we can try to see the ideology of contemporary society. And like, ideology is always invisible, right? It's the water that we swim in. But there's so many things, these facts that we just like take for granted, that are actually just absurd. Like that, the power of these platforms, and the way we're organizing where investments go, and where our interest as a society, where those interests flow. We can actually question that and realize that there's nothing natural about it. But I think in terms of like resisting platforms, what I think will actually change things is political organization. Like, not using TikTok, not using Twitter, whatever, it's not gonna lead to the change, because these are structural issues, and we need political organizing to try to change things. So I think that is, to me, like what would be my recommendation, is to try to imagine something being different, coming together with others who also imagine something different, and trying to become a political force.
Mm-hmm. And I think even you say in one place that resistance is good, but it's insufficient. We need creation.
This being able to, or daring to dream of, what we've been calling utopia, of things being different, and the idea that we can organize society differently, and we can use these new, really amazing powers that technology brings us. We can use them for something that would actually make the world a better place, not a more profitable place, but a better place.
Mm-hmm. Peter, what's the best place for people to find more about you and your work?
So Blue Sky is probably the best place. I post a lot of my research as kind of summarized threads that I explain them clearly. So that would probably be the best place. Also post whatever interviews and articles I write. So yeah, you can find me there.
Well, the last question that I always ask of my interviewees is this: what's the final message that you want to send us away with? Is it something that I should have asked you and I didn't, that you think it's very important? Or is it something that you want to reinforce or to bring our attention to? What's the best way to wrap up our conversation here today?
I think we've covered most of it, but I think if I want to emphasize something, it is the idea that change is possible, and that these technologies could enable us to have a really amazing society, but it requires political power, and it requires us to organize and try to create that society and to be able to imagine it.
Change is possible, but requires political power. And if I may add, it requires commitment. In other words, it requires a skin in the game. We need to be willing to sacrifice something within that game of politics towards change. Otherwise, as long as we're not willing to have any skin in the game, we can just go and wave our flags and then go home and nothing changes.
Yeah, I think that's well put.
Well, Petr Törnberg, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. It was a really great conversation. I enjoyed it.